Alrighty, well, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for another virtual conversation with LeaderShape. My name is Kristen Young, and I'm excited to be here with you all this afternoon, and just to talk about the concepts of understanding context before content. So as we get started, let's just kind of do a little overview of our platform and what we're using today. So on the next slide, you'll see how to use the platform. We're also familiar with Zoom, so I won't go through it in its entirety, but we will be using this as we go together, as we engage in this conversation. Sam will have some polls that he will use to gather information, so we'll invite you to respond to those, and we'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. If you do have some questions for either Sam or myself, please feel free to put them in the chat or to share them with us in a private message. We're happy to answer those questions for you. And, depending on our time, we may not have time for everybody to come on camera and on a microphone to ask your questions, but we will do our very best to read all of the comments that you all place in the chat. So with that, Sam, let's talk a little bit about the texting. Do you want to explain that, or the polling? Do you want to explain that real quick?
Sure. Thanks, Kristen. And so you will see in the chat that Melissa has, and she will from time to time put in the link for Poll Everywhere. So you just click on that link and it'll take you to Poll Everywhere. It'll ask you to register. You're going to put in Washington Co 908. So Poll Everywhere / Washington Co 908. And it will walk you through the steps that you need to do to register that way, or you can text Washington Co 908 to 37607 and follow the instructions there as well. Again, just constantly watch the chat box and you will see the link to do that.
Perfect. Well, as we get started, I want us to just kind of center ourselves and think about where we are today as we begin this conversation. And I want to do that by reading a land acknowledgement. LeaderShape would like to begin this presentation by acknowledging that the land that each of us is on today is the original homelands of indigenous and tribal nations. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from these territories, and we honor and respect the many diverse indigenous peoples still connected to this land. Please honor and acknowledge the Native and Indigenous peoples from the land that you are joining us from, and give that thought to your ancestry and the generations that came before you. I always like to acknowledge just those who did come before us in these spaces. So if you also, as you think about this, if you're new to LeaderShape, and a little bit about who we are a not-for-profit organization that is working to create a more just, caring, and thriving world where all lead with integrity and a healthy disregard for the impossible. And we do that by engaging people in conversations, from this virtual space that we're in now to, at some point, once again, being able to gather in person. We believe one of the best ways to do that is to have conversations about topics that matter and topics that are that resonate with the values that we all share. And so with that, want to begin our conversation. So again, I'm Kristen Young, and I serve as the executive director of LeaderShape, and I'm really excited to be able to be here with you all, and want to introduce my very dear friend, Reverend Sam Offer. Sam, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and then guide us in this conversation?
Wonderful. Thank you, Kristen. And I am so honored to be with my LeaderShape family today. Again, Sam Offer, he, him, his pronouns. I am joining you from the beautiful city of Baltimore here in Maryland, where the ancestral is the ancestral land of the Piscataway tribe. And so as Kristen named, I pause to honor and to recognize the indigenous folks who are a part of this land, continue to be a part of this land. Today's conversation, context before content, invites us to think about the value of context, the value of why we must consider it and pay attention to it in intentional and deliberate ways as we are doing our leadership training, as we are working with students, as we're working with one another, as leadership educators, it is important for us to understand why context matters. How I got to this particular topic is through two incredible people in my life, and they are both wonderful people in higher ed. The first one is Dr. Michael Sujay, who is a former professor at the University of Louisville, and Reverend Dr. Jamie Washington, who is the president of the Washington Consulting Group, where I serve as the vice president. Jamie was in a session where Dr. Sujay was doing a training, and Dr. Sujay talked about the value of context. And it began to trigger, to invite curiosity, and Dr. Washington began to do some exploration. As we began to do our work together, he mentioned this concept to me: context before content. And I began to think about what that means for the work that I am doing around leadership development, as I think about trainings that I do, as I think about working with students, as I think about working with staff, administration. Why is it important to consider context? And so I want to offer us this as a backdrop to this conversation, that a primary role in higher education is to prepare the next generation of leaders. So whether we're preparing a nurse or a doctor, or someone who wants to be an incredible musician, or someone who wants to be an administrator or the president, in whatever ways that leadership show up, higher ed, we have a responsibility to make sure we are preparing the next generation to lead. As we think about this leadership practice, as we think about preparing the next generation, context matters. Context matters, and we'll talk more about ways in which context show up. And so one of the things that I want to invite us to understand is that leaders will need the capacity, the skills, the ability to engage within, across, and about difference. So as we're preparing them as leaders in their discipline, they must also be able to engage across difference. Because what we know is that difference shows up in the room all the time. And our conversation today invites us to think about context as we're training leaders through a lens of DEI. And so I want to invite you, as I see some folks are already doing this, I want to invite you to kind of just go to Poll Everywhere. And again, you can scroll down in the chat, click on Melissa's name. It'll say Tech Melissa, and you can log into Poll Everywhere. Once you, just as we're thinking about this conversation, want to just do some polling that creates context. So what's your role? What's your role? As you think about student leadership, as you think about leadership I saw director and then went to say leadership director, but as you're thinking about leadership development, what's your role? Academic advisor, faculty member, student activities, student organizing, or trainer, or a facilitator, or other things. Inviting you to put that in the poll so that we can see who's in the room with us. I'm so happy to see that there's a Sam fan in the room as well, as we think about leadership development.
I should have put that in. Can I respond again, Sam? I thought that was a given. I thought that was a given in this.
It is a given, yes, and you can respond again, right? And so just pay attention to what's our roles. And I want you to see, as we have this conversation, who's joining you in this conversation today. I have a couple more polls that I will invite you to do. And as we move through those polls, I will count you down 4, 3, 2, 1. That says we're closing the poll and moving to the next one. So we see director, we see information, we see consultants, we see graduates, we see academics, we see counselors, we see vice president for student affairs, we see direct development. And so just pay attention to all of our different roles, as all of these roles are necessary for developing leadership. I want to also ask you this next question to just respond to: who are you supporting? Who are you supporting? Is it residential life, student leaders? Are you supporting student development, student government, orientation leaders, peer educators, or others? Just go to the poll and respond there too. So just pay attention to your function, who you're supporting. As we have this conversation, what we're doing is establishing context. We are establishing context. 4, 3, 2, 1. There's one other poll I want to invite you into. Where do you serve? Do you serve at an HBCU, a historically Black college university, an Asian serving institution, a Hispanic serving institution, tribal college, PWI, community college? Are you a professional who may not necessarily be on a college campus? Or are there other ways in which you are serving? And as I think about that, folks, I want us to understand that while the focus is in higher education, context matters in all of the places in which we serve. And so we're inviting you to pay attention to that as we are in this conversation together. So as you think about your function, who you are serving, and where you are serving, as a backdrop to this conversation, I want you to just kind of, in your body, just begin to think about what are some of the opportunities and challenges you have encountered in leader development, whether that is student leader development, whether you're a part of a religious organization, whether you are a part of a nonprofit. What are some of the challenges, opportunities that you have encountered in leadership development? And so just think about, so I've struggled with this in my role. I've struggled with this, or this has come up and I'd like to have some answers to that. And what I want you to do with that is then add a diversity, equity, and an inclusion lens to that. Because much of our conversation today will be through the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I want you to add that lens to it. And as you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, how have you experienced or encountered challenges and opportunities as a person who is developing leaders for the next generation? Just kind of think about that. You might want to put some of that in the chat to share with one another in a way that as you're putting in the chat, folks can say, yep, I experienced that too. Yep, I experienced that too. So what are some challenges and opportunities that you are facing? And I'm going to invite you to go to the chat to do that. I'm just fascinated by the folks that keep saying they're Sam fans. And so it's just amazing to have such family to be here with us today.
You absolutely do. Well, I'm interested to see what people start to put in the chat, Sam, as you think about where those challenges and opportunities have come together, with thinking about how you're educating leaders, and thinking about too often, I think about for me and in our role at LeaderShape, I think too about the wide spectrum from which people enter in their own leadership development, and how do you engage in that conversation around issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion when everyone is entering from different points, and having different values, right? So where do you how do you engage in that conversation?
Yeah, so what you name, Kristen, is again part of the conversation that we will have today around context, right?
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
we will talk about different ways in which we must pay attention to context in order for us to be successful in leadership development, right?
Yep.
What I often have found out as folks are doing leadership development, that when it doesn't go well, that often people go to content first. So what happened with the content? What went wrong with the content? What information didn't we have right? What do we need to rearrange? What do we need to reorganize? Was it our outline? That we have enough information so folks will go to the content and they will consider the content because they feel like the content was not good enough. And so lots of time, the struggle, the challenges, they hold it around the content. What we want to offer folks today in this conversation is to really get clear that often about 60 to 65% of when we have challenges, when we are encountering opportunities, it is often because of the context more
Hmm.
than it is because of the content. And so we
Absolutely.
invite folks to lead with context. Lead with context. And when I say to folks to lead with context, what I'm asking folks to do is to think about how is context impacting the content. So we're going to do a lesson today, and our focus today is around DEI, which is the content. But how is the context impacting that, right? And so as we think about that, we get to think about context. Context is the factors that have a potential to shift an outcome by altering the process. So we're going to have a conversation about DEI. And that conversation can be race, it could be gender identity, it can be religion, it can be sexuality. We can have all kind of conversations around DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what we must pay attention to is what are those factors that would shift the outcome that we have set out for. And so, what I say to folks all the time, you must first get clear about your outcome. So, what is it that we're trying to accomplish? What is it that we're trying to do? What's our goals? What's our outcome? And then, what are the things as we are coming together to engage the content that might shift or cause our outcome not to happen, that might disrupt the process? Does that make sense, folks? And so, Kristen, what are you seeing in the chat?
So what I'm seeing in the chat, I think you're that's along the lines of what you're talking about, Sam, is that, and I see Bryce mentioning here when you asked about kind of what are the opportunities. The students are expecting more and they're tired of rhetoric and they want that to change, right? That some of that is context too, right? They're tired of hearing the same things over and over and over again. And so how are we changing that? And Terry, kind of along the same lines, Terry mentions, how do you make sure DEI is embedded in all of our thinking and work and not just a one-off, right? And so that it is part of the fabric of what you're offering. Absolutely.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about all of those things that will help us to focus, to Terry's point, that helps it to become more a part of the process,
Right.
that helps it to feel like it is a natural thing to do. And so I will share a story with you, is that when I first start doing context and paying attention to it, um, it felt odd. Right,
Mm.
it felt odd because
Sure.
that's not the way that I learned to teach, right? And so
Right.
I've been teaching for many years, and as a teacher, what I learned is you focus on the lesson, you focus on the lesson, you focus on the lesson. And so I was teaching my lesson, but I was not paying attention to who was in the room, what was
Right.
happening in the room, what was taking place in the room, what were folks experiencing. I was focusing more on my content than I was the context. And so some of the challenges I met was that what I realized is that while I was teaching, lots of students weren't getting it, right? They weren't understanding, and lots of that was not about what I was offering them. It was about the how. It was about the when. It was about the where, right? And what I want to invite us into is the how, the when, and the where. Context first. So context is a teaching practice. And what I want people to understand is just like content is important, so is context. Just like we spend time thinking about our lesson plans, thinking about our syllabus, thinking about what we're going to offer our students, how we're going to develop them, we must also think about context. Context is also a part of our teaching practice. It has to become a part of that. What I offer folks, Kristen, is that context is a container, right? It is the framework, it's what we get to think about as to where and how we are offering the subject matter. So I always say to folks is that you can't put hot coffee in certain containers because it doesn't work.
Doesn't work.
It doesn't work.
Doesn't work.
Right? There are some drinks that you can't put in a metal container because if you put it in a metal container and the chemistry doesn't work, right? And so the container is important, or the framework. And I'm sure lots of people have pictures in your home, and you know when you're putting up a picture, one of the things that you want to pay attention to is, does my picture fit in the frame? Right? Because what good is a frame? What good is a frame if the picture is not right? Right?
That's a great analogy, Sam, right? Like nobody takes a little 4x6 picture and puts it in an 8x10 frame and goes, oh, that's perfect, right? Like it don't work.
It doesn't work, right? And so we must pay attention to the container, the framework that is holding the content, right? And so we want us to pay attention to that. When we do context first, context minimizes distractions, allowing us to center on the content, right? And I'm going to offer us 7 things that we can focus on around context. And as what I believe is when we focus on those things, then it minimizes some of the distractions. So I'm going to give us an example. I was doing a session one time, and I was wondering why folks were not responsive. And, you know, I was like, so I want to create an environment where folks can use their voice and their voice can be heard. And, you know, I took a break and I was like, I wonder what's going on, right? And folks came up to me and said, it's cold in here.
Sure.
Right? And I thought the context was about my content, right?
But
what am I not
nothing
doing?
To do with you.
And it was
nothing to do with you.
Had nothing to do with it at all, right? And everything to do with it, right? But it was about the distraction. It was a distraction in the room. And so folks could not center on the content, right? And so content must be engaged throughout the process. So when I say context first, I mean context must be engaged throughout the process. When I say context first, I'm not just talking about engaging context at the beginning. I'm inviting us to think about how are we engaging context at the beginning, throughout the process, and at the end of the process. One of the great things that I learned by working with some amazing folks and the staff at SJTI was the engaging of context. So we would talk about the context prior to a session. We would huddle up on a break and talk about context. We get together at the end of the session and talk about context and how context is informing this process. What we learned and what I learned as I did incredible work with those folks is that context matters, and it is often 60 to 65% of the disruption of why we didn't get the outcome that we wanted. And so,
Absolutely. It makes sense. It makes perfect sense, right? Because it's what is distracting you from being able to be in the content, right? Because it is a higher priority. And I appreciate what you're saying, Sam, of having to re-engage with it as you go through your programming, because you never know what content and the way that you deliver it, how that might impact somebody's emotional reaction or physical reaction to what's going on. They didn't have that reaction before you shared a story, that now they connect to you in a different way. And so that changes the context of the conversation that you're in. And so I appreciate that. And it's a great reminder, because I think we can forget about it and think, well, I checked in at the beginning, everyone seemed fine. But we don't think about what I add to that when I add myself or other people add their stories or examples.
yeah, and I think, Kristen, as you named, is that's where often the disconnect happens,
Mm-hmm.
right? Is
Mm-hmm.
because when we do it first, we feel clear, but because we're not engaging context throughout, then it becomes less clear of our
Yep.
process, right?
Yep.
And so we must pause and pay attention to that. And then to most effectively engage within, across, and about difference, we must understand the role that context plays, right? And so, which invites me into this place that if we're going to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we must think about context. Context plays a major role in engaging within and across difference. And so, as we think about that, I want to offer us seven things to think about: the me, the you, so the individual, the collective, the group, the us, the we, power dynamics, environment, location, history, present day, and I want to add to that future, right?
Mm-hmm.
Time, timing, and engagement. I'm going to offer these to you in several ways to think about this. And Kristen, I love that we're having this conversation in an engaging way, so feel free to jump in.
Yeah.
But the first piece around context is the social piece, right? The social context. So we get to pay attention to the me, the you, the us, the we, the power dynamics, social context. Who am I and what am I carrying, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's my cultural awareness? What's my cultural lens? Do I understand myself? Do I understand how race shows up in me? Do I understand my own class? Do I understand my own gender and gender identity and how that shows up and how that interacts with others, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so what I tell people all the time is I've been Black all my life, right? I was born Black, right? And every time I look in the mirror, I see this Black face. And I'm happy to be a Black person. And what I tell people is just because I'm Black does not mean I understand the dynamics of Blackness.
Sure.
Context matters, right? And so we have to pay attention to that. Who are you and do you understand who you are, right? Who are they? Who are you engaging, right? Around identities, and do we understand how those identities will show up in the room around the
Mm-hmm.
content? Us. So, Kristen, you
That
talked
makes sense.
about this. So again, context shifts, right?
Right.
And so there's a context when I'm by myself. It's easy, right? Nobody's bothering me. So it's just one person and I just get to do it this way, right?
Right. Right. Right.
You and I are in the room and it shifts the context,
Absolutely.
right? And so
Absolutely, it does.
now we have to pay attention to how do we engage with one another? What does this interaction look like? Because
Right.
there is context in the room that has shifted, right?
Right. Right.
When we add someone else to the room, if we add all of the Sam fans in this conversation, right? We bring all of them into the room, it will shift the context. So then we must pay attention to the us and the we. And so what happens is a lot of times we can be having a conversation, and we might be having a conversation about race, and that might be within a like group, right? It might be in a same racial group identity. That is a very different conversation than when we're having a conversation across race.
Right.
And how do we pay attention to that? The me, you, who am I? Who are you? Do I understand myself? What do I know about you? What do I know about the other person? And that doesn't mean I have to understand your intimate personal story, right? But it does help for me to know some of the stories, and it does help for me to do my own work to understand context that is not a part of who I am.
Right. Yep.
And so what does it mean for me as a Black person to engage race with a white person? What does it mean for me as a same gender loving gay person to engage sexuality with a heterosexual person? What does it mean for me as a Christian to engage with an atheist? Right? Context matters. Context matters. Power dynamics are another part of social context. So we might be in the room doing leadership development, and what happens when the vice president of student affairs walks in?
Right. That changes it, right?
It
How do those things?
changes it.
Absolutely.
It changes it, right? And so
It could. It may or may not. I guess it may or may not, depending on the person, depending on their role, depending on how that is structured. It may not. In some cases, it may in others, right? And not to generalize that it would always change it, but potentially it could.
Yeah, and so yes, and so it might not change the energy that's in the room, but it does change the dynamic in the room, right? Whether folks are okay with the vice president walking in the room or not, when the vice president walks in, there's a power dynamic that shifts, right? And so then we get to ask ourselves, so how does that impact what we're doing, right? How does that impact this conversation or the work that we're doing around diversity, equity, and inclusion? So power dynamics are real, right? And what I found out, Kristen, as I do this work, is that is one of the places where lots of people struggle, and one of the places where folks often don't consider context, right? Right? And so they might consider context that I don't want to talk because somebody is in the room, but they don't consider that we have our VP for Student Affairs in the room, or we have our VP of Academic Affairs in the room, or we have our president in the room. So are we making sure we're creating a context where folks can engage, right? And they can do that in a successful way. The next part of context is physical, right? And so we get to think about environment, location, surrounding. We talked a little bit about this. And so again, the temperature in the room is context, and it will impact the content. We also get to pay attention to our environment. And so whether I am having a conversation with a student or a group, what's the environment that I'm inviting them in, right? And so what I know is that when I was teaching regularly and I would have students to come to my office, there was a different kind of energy when I was sitting behind my desk than when I went to the couch.
Right.
Context matters, right? And so what happened in that moment that created a different context, a different environment in that moment, right? Are we doing leadership development, and are we paying attention to the location, right? And so I was doing a session one time, and we did the session inside of a church. Context matters.
Context matters.
And we're talking about all of the dynamics of difference, and religion is a part of that, right? And so context, who is able to be in that space and be okay, right?
Right.
Who finds themselves in the church and not okay. So the environment, the location matters. The configuration of the room matters, matters, right? And so are we engaging around tables? And are the tables preventing us from having effective engagement, right?
Right.
Physical context matters, and we must slow down and pay attention to that, right? I tell people all the time, I don't like doing trainings from a podium, right? Because
Right.
what that does is it separates me from my audience. Context
Right.
matters, right?
Right.
Now that's just for Sam. That's just for
Well,
Sam.
and it's interesting that you said that, Sam, because so like many of us, have not been in the front of a group of people in the same physical space in over a year to facilitate anything like that. I've been like we are here on Zoom. I was in my first group of 9 people last week, and I used a podium to help me keep my physical distance for safety. So I, like you, would never have used a podium before. That was not my style. But as I was in the room, we were all socially distanced, and I like to walk around. And I was like, oh, wait a second, I can't walk around anymore. So I used that podium to remind me of, like, this is my line. Here's where I am for health reasons, being safe, and I won't cross it. But it was a very different, as we think about location, like that was a really different experience for me. In the context, I didn't think of it until it happened, and I was like, oh, this is different, right? But this is what we need to do.
Yeah. And what do we have to work through in order to be effective?
Right.
Right. And so as you talk about that, even in this virtual space, context matters, right?
Mhm,
It is
mhm.
it is very different. We are in a two-dimensional, it's location, it's environment. And
Right.
how does that two-dimensional impact the content?
Yep.
Right. And so what we know is that we're learning that you can't be in a virtual presence for more than 2.5 hours with a 30-minute break, or you done lost people, right?
Right, people are done. Nobody's doing
Context
no.
matters, right? Especially because, in the physical, we had food, we had apples and
Mhm.
oranges and orange juice, and you can't do that in this
Right,
space, right? And
right,
so,
right.
again, the physical matters. The other is context around time. So we get to think about history, right? We get to think about present day. And so that's context around events. So
Mm,
what has happened, right? In our local areas, what have happened on a global level, what has happened on a national level, all of those things inform the content, particularly when we're doing DEI work, right?
mhm,
As we're
mhm.
thinking about right now, we are in a very race tension space,
Mhm.
right? How is that impacting the work that we are doing around leadership development through a DEI lens,
Right.
right? So what are we noticing? What are we experiencing? What are the challenges that we are experiencing? Because that matters. The
Mhm.
present day matters. Then we also have to pay attention to the history because the history informs the present day,
Right, right.
right? So pay attention to the history because history is what happened yesterday, what happened the week before, what happened last month, what
Mhm.
happened 2 years ago, that is informing what we're trying to do today, right? So, how do we pay attention to that? And then the future, right? So, when we think about the future, we get to think about what are our expectations? What are our expectations? What are our outcomes? What are we trying to do? And how are we meeting those, right? Context helps us to pay attention to where we have been, where we are, and where we're trying to go. Then we have context around time and timing. And so, context around time and timing shows up for me in two ways. It shows up in, first of all, the investment. So, as we're thinking about doing leadership development, are we investing the time that is needed to have our next generation to be equipped with what they need
Mm,
to lead, right? And so we got
mhm.
to pay attention to the investment, particularly with doing work around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Lots of times what folks do is they do a check box type thing. And
Sure.
they're very performative in their behavior. And so what they're doing is that we're doing this because we need to save face, right?
Right.
And then
Right.
we wonder why it's not working. It's because of the context. Have we put in enough time? Have we invested enough time? Have we invested the money that creates the time, right? And so
Right.
time is important. And then timing, have we really spent time thinking about when we're doing it,
Sure.
right? I tell people all the time, you can't talk about race and when someone has had a flat tire day,
Right. Sure. Right.
right?
Right.
I tell
Yeah.
people all the time, I was going into work one time, Kristen, and I had a flat tire. And I had AAA, I called AAA, and it took AAA 3 hours to get there. And that's
Right.
not my day to walk into the office and say, okay, folks, let's circle up and let's talk about race,
Right. Right.
right? That's
Right.
not
We're not.
the best timing,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? And so how are we paying attention to timing? How are we using good judgment? So are we trying to do DEI work, right? And it's all right to do it during our welcome week, but what's the limitations that happen around that? What's the limitations that happen when we think about places where we're trying to do this work and the timing is not good? Are we trying to have a conversation about gender equity? And there has been an event that has happened on campus that is saying this timing is not good,
Right.
right? And
Right.
so how are we paying attention to time? And then the last one is engagement. And so engagement is context as well, because it invites us to think about what's our interactions with one another? What's our connection with one another? And so, today you and I are having a fun time engaging.
Right.
But what happens when engagement is not like this?
Right. It's a little bit more intense and not look at someone that's not looking forward to it, which is often the case when we're talking about topics of DEI, right? There is apprehension in that engagement sometimes.
Yeah, and often because DEI comes to the table because folks are trying to be reactive. They
Right.
are they are responding to something, right? So often we're doing a session because we had this
Right.
incident on
Where we're
campus, and so we need to respond to this. So we had this incident within our organization, and we need to respond to this, right? And so that's a different kind of
hmm
engagement when we are being responsive, when we're being reactive, than when we're being proactive.
Right. Right. But when we're thinking about the context, right? When we're having these conversations on a regular basis, then when that incident does happen, the context is different, but you're used to engaging in those conversations around the topics. So yes,
Yeah.
Vernon says no more town halls, please.
you
Please,
know, you
no
know,
more.
I get it because, the context of that engagement, right?
Right.
And who gets heard and who doesn't get heard, right? Who voices matter, who voice don't matter, that have folks to walk away feeling like that this was not a successful outcome, right? Because it's shifting the outcome, it's shifting the process, right? And then the other thing that I always ask ourselves is, what's the work that I have done to create the environment that I want to engage in?
Absolutely.
And that starts first with me, right?
hmm
What's the way I want to be in this engaging conversation, right? How do I want to show up, right? And then how do I want my students to show up? How do I want my team to show up? So are we establishing norms? Are we establishing agreements that invite us into a way to be, right?
Right.
And then we're holding ourselves accountable to live out of those,
Right. Right.
right?
And we're practicing living out of those when tensions are not high and when tensions are high, right? So you're establishing a way of being that would transcend the situations that you will be in and the context that will change over time. So I appreciate that greatly, Sam, because I think that it stops us from have to be reactionary, right? When that is how we are entering into spaces on a regular basis.
Yeah. And you know, I think we think about this when we're doing student trainings for like RAs and orientation leaders. We think about engagement, we come up with norms, we do norming, we gather together, we get on the floor, we give people big sheets of paper, we think about that. And how do we do and think about engagement on a one-to-one?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right? And
Right.
so, have I thought about engagement when a student walk into my office? Right?
Right.
Have I
Right.
thought about engagement when I'm walking across the campus and I see someone? Right? Have I thought about that? Because that's all ways in which we engage with one another, right?
Right.
That
Right.
sends messages. That sends messages. I was just doing a session the other day, and someone just said to me, said, well, I don't feel like I can talk to our board members because whenever they're in the hallway, they never say hello.
Hmm.
Engagement.
Right. It's simple. It's that, like, even just that first step, right, of welcoming and saying hello. And I think it also, Vernon mentioned here in his chat comments, that people are in pain, and how do we deal with that pain first? And so thinking then, how, as a leader in an organization, do I deal with and have space for all of the emotions and reactions that people will have, so that my engagement is not, well, I only engage people on their happy days. I only engage people when they're feeling really good, and I know how to do that. But how do I engage with people on their really difficult days, when there is pain? And what does that mean? And how do I do that?
Yeah, and I tell people all the time, when we recognize people's humanity, they open up and we can
Hmm.
do work together, right?
Absolutely.
So anytime I'm doing a session, I always start, and folks that know WCG know that we start with what we call what's up, right?
Hmm.
We invite folks to enter into the conversation with what's up, how are you feeling as you engage with us today, right? We invite folks to be where they are, and
Hmm.
to we meet them there, be in that process with them so that they are able to move through. Now,
Right.
some of that pain takes longer moving through than others, but when people feel valued, heard, and respected, then they show up very differently in engagement, right?
Absolutely.
And so, what I tell people all the time is, what's the work that we are doing to make folks feel valued, to make folks feel heard, and to make folks feel respected? That does not mean I have to agree with everything that you say. But
Right.
how does my engagement invite you in to a space where you feel valued, where you feel heard, and where you feel respected, right?
Mm.
And how are we paying attention to that as we're in this, right? Me, you, us, we, power dynamics, social context. Environment, location invites us into physical context. History, present day, future expectations invite us into the context around event. Time, investment, whether or not it is the appropriate time to do it, invites us into the context of time and timing, and of course, engagement. And what we know, Kristen, is that none of these are separate. They don't ever stand alone. They are all always happening simultaneously.
Right. And that's the piece that I know is always so evolving and changing, is that because they are intermixed with each other, right? And even over the course of 45 minutes in engagement with someone, all of these things are still at play, and sometimes some rise higher to your awareness than others, right? But they're always still there as part of that context. So I appreciate seeing that, and seeing too, as you listed them, how they are all connected.
Yeah. And so it requires us, as folks who are developing our next generation of leaders, and as folks who are doing this work, it requires us to understand this first,
Hmm.
right?
Absolutely.
about myself. So do I understand my own context? Do I understand how to engage it across difference, right? Do I understand groupness and how groupness shows up, right? And that's the us and the we, right? Do I understand groupness and how that shows up? Do I understand how myself individually and as groups were impacted by systems,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Right.
organizations, and that informs the content, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is part of the context. How does power play into this, whether that is power dynamics because of role, because of position, or whether that is power dynamics because of privilege?
Right. Right.
How does that play into
How it plays into it.
right? I tell folks all the time, it took me a while to understand when folks used to say to me, Sam, that was a sexist behavior, to see how my maleness was playing into that. Because no one could have been nicer than Sam Offer,
Right.
right?
Right.
So
But it's hard
no,
for us to hear that about ourselves and to see when we are in our areas of privilege when those come up. It is difficult for us to hear.
yeah. And so once I slowed down and really began to interrogate that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And listen, context invites us to listen to what's happening around us, right? What I'm being told, what I'm learning, how does that show up? Then, and how is that informing the outcome that I'm trying to have? Then I get to ask myself the question, so what about me in this,
Right.
right?
Right.
What
Yeah,
about what about
we
the
play an
environment?
important role in that. Mm-hmm.
Exactly, right? Because take me out of it, then well, then, like all of this kind of goes away, right?
That's right. Or it changes, right? Because then when there's another person in your role doing your facilitation, right, it also makes me think about how many programs that we might have on our campuses or within our organizations that multiple people facilitate. And how does that change when someone else is the facilitator of the same content? Like we're doing the same content, but this session had this experience and this session had that experience. And sometimes that is because of who's facilitating and then how we change the context in which that session is taking place.
Yeah. What I tell people all the time is that the content can be the same, just as you just named, Kristen. The content can be the same in different places, and alongside the context, it will change it, right? And
Absolutely.
just as you named, we can be talking about all of these big eight, big nine, big 10 type things that we talk about often around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we can have the same information that we're sharing all the time, right?
Mhm.
And the context will shift how we share that information, how we engage that information, how we engage that study. Because having a conversation around religion with a group of Christians is very different than having it with Christians and non-Christians in the room,
Right. Right. Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
So how are we paying attention to context before content? And so what we're inviting ourselves again to do is to ask the question, what's the context that might happen, that might show up, that might shift the outcome that we're trying to get to?
And
When
with that, Tim, didn't you have some questions for us as we're almost at the top of our hour. So I think you had some guiding questions for us to kind of think about.
And so those guiding questions invite us to think about, so what are some of the pitfalls when context is not considered first, right? And
Mm.
so you get to ask yourself this question, so what are some of the things that I have experienced, that I have seen when context is not considered? I will give you just a couple. There's a loss of focus, right? And so again, when you're in the room and you haven't paid attention to context, who's in the room, right?
Right.
There can be a loss of focus. I know I have been in the room where I have lost focus, or the focus around the content have been lost, right? There's a misunderstanding of one another that shows up when we don't carefully consider context. And there is also the misengaging of information, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so often what happens around that is that then what we're trying to do falls apart.
Yep.
Right? Because
Yep.
we haven't considered context. Folks ask me all the time, so Sam, this seems like a time-consuming concept. And how do we employ this in an already busy schedule? Right? I say to folks 3 words: practice, practice, practice.
Right.
Right? And it does take up time, right? It does take up time. When I was first learning, as we wrap here, when I was first learning how to cook, right? It took me time to make an apple pie because I didn't know what I was doing.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
But now I know what I'm doing, and I can make an apple pie in about 30 minutes.
Sounds delicious. I'll be there in about 45.
You said I'm on my way.
I'm on my way. I've got a long way to go.
Practice got me to the place where it became more second nature. It became a part of my process. It became something that I got used to. So what I say to folks, while it may seem time consuming in the beginning, keep practicing. The more you practice, the easier it becomes, right? And it becomes a part of how we do this work. Context.
And it's just how it goes into how we're writing content too, right? You put that much work into the content that you write, right? We read and we find the best activities, we find the right research articles. And so it's taking that time and putting some of that into looking at how we do the context as well, so that information can be received.
Mm-hmm. And so we get to pay attention to how context impacts the content.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And again, I just want to say to folks that a big part of doing DEI work requires us to pay attention to context. It does not mean that we don't make sure we got good content. We need to make sure we got good content and that we have done our work around our content. But we often do that because we're educators.
Right, right.
And often where we drop the ball is around the context. I hope this has been helpful for folks.
Thank you. I think it has been helpful for me. I see other people, giving some good emojis, that it's been helpful for them as well. Because and I think what you're talking about, Sam, is we do provide great content. And so how are we thinking about the context in which we provide that so it can be heard and that it can be applied to that next generation of leaders, the people we're trying to prepare. And, what I was struck with, Sam, as you were talking, is that how important it is for us to continue to do that work. We're continuing to learn, right? As educators, our learning doesn't stop. And so how do we continue to do that and role model that then as well for that next generation of leaders? So thank you for your time and your brilliance and just sharing that with us. As we kind of end our time here together, I do want to, put in a brief plug for LeaderShape. If there are things, as you all are in your organizations or on your campuses thinking about, how can you provide leadership training for your peers, for your students, for your administrators, please let us know how we can help. That is our goal as a not-for-profit, is we really want to make sure that we're coming alongside of you all and giving you all tools to prepare leaders to engage in conversations around their values, around issues of equity and inclusion, and around integrity. So if we can do that, here's our information to do that with and to reach out to us, please do. And, I would not be remiss if I did not say thank you again, Sam, for your time and your effort and your energy today. It was great to spend some time with you. I hope all the Sam fans on our call got to enjoy their time as well. Sam and I will hang out here for just another minute or two. If you have other questions that you would like to, or need other resources, or just want to say hi, we'll do that for another minute or two. Otherwise, enjoy your afternoon.